Okay. Heads up.
Welcome to the National Press Theatre. Bienvenue au Théâtre National de la Presse. With us this afternoon, the Honourable Erin O'Toole, Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, and Stephanie Kersey, Shadow Minister for Democratic Institutions. We'll start with opening statements from both of them, and then we'll follow with question period.
Merci beaucoup. Good afternoon. I'm pleased to be joined today by my colleague MP Stephanie Kersey, who was a member of Canada's Foreign Service before her election to Parliament in 2015. Like many MPs, Stephanie and I have been hearing from Canadian families over the last month concerned about family members in China, or those who are uncertain about their own decisions related to travel to that country. Let me begin by saying that the Conservative caucus are deeply concerned by the detention of the two Canadians who were arrested as a result of the diplomatic tensions between Canada and China. Mr. Korvig and Mr. Spavor are example of two of the exceptional Canadians that take their skills and expertise for jobs in China. We share the concerns of their families and their friends following their arbitrary arrests last month. Last month, our leader, Andrew Scheer, asked Prime Minister Trudeau to intervene personally with China on the detention of the two Canadians because of the retaliatory nature of their arrests. The Prime Minister once again showed a profoundly naive approach to diplomacy when he refused to get involved directly and compared the arrest of these Canadians to consular cases like that of Mr. Fahmy. The Prime Minister knows that Mrs. Korvig and Spavor were detained as a diplomatic retaliation to an extradition arrest of a Chinese business executive in Canada, an arrest he was advised about ahead of time. Canada is now engaged in a diplomatic tit-for-tat with China as a result of this arrest and the Prime Minister's refusal to call the Chinese president to begin to de-escalate the situation has many Canadian families deeply concerned. They are questioning travel to China, and they're concerned about the well-being of their family members working there now. We know that dozens of Canadians have been detained on administrative grounds or have had their visas questioned following the arrest of Ms. Wang Zhu. Il y a un mois, notre chef Andrew Scheer a demandé au Premier ministre de s'impliquer directement dans le conflit avec la Chine. Il a refusé et considère que la détention de Canadiens est semblable à toute autre affaire consulaire. Suite à l'inaction du Premier ministre, des dizaines de familles sont inquiètes. Et les deux Canadiens, M. Korvig et M. Spavor, sont toujours en prison sans contact avec le Canada. Yesterday, the Prime Minister called President Trump to discuss the situation with China. Prime Minister Trudeau is willing to call the U.S. President to discuss the arrest of a Chinese citizen in Canada, but he will not call the Chinese President to discuss the arbitrary arrest of two Canadian citizens in China. C'est frustrant pour beaucoup de Canadiens. Le Premier ministre Trudeau a appelé le président des États-Unis pour discuter de la détention d'un citoyen chinois au Canada, mais il n'appelle pas le président chinois pour discuter de la détention de deux Canadiens en Chine. Accordingly, the Conservative opposition is asking the Liberal government to get serious about the present dispute with China. We advise them to do two things. First, the Prime Minister should immediately call President Xi to de-escalate the situation. The goal of his call should be to show that the head of government in Canada is seized with the situation and has a personal interest in its resolution. He should work towards securing the release of the two Canadians, or at the very least, ensure that daily consular access should be afforded to these Canadian citizens, not the minimal consular access that is currently being granted by China. Second, the government needs to provide certainty to thousands of Canadian families with family members working in China or those considering travel to the country. Hundreds of Canadian families are asking questions about traveling or working in China. Yesterday, a former Liberal Foreign Affairs Minister advised Canadians not to travel to China with this dispute ongoing. The government needs to either update the travel advisory for China or provide Canadians with the assurances that there are no risks as a result of the current diplomatic dispute. What assurances can the Prime Minister give Canadians that are understandably concerned? My colleague MP Stephanie Cusey.
Merci, Erin, et merci pour l'occasion d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. You may or may not know, but I was in fact a proud member of the Canadian Consular Corps for close to a decade and a half. And I want to start off by saying that Erin, myself, and all of our Conservative colleagues have all of the confidence in our consular staff abroad who work hard every day to serve and to help Canadians when they are away from home. And these are people who are very well trained. There is a rigorous training process. There are procedures which are followed. These people know what they are doing abroad. However, unfortunately, conditions are different in prison abroad compared to Canada, and conditions are different every place that you go in the world. You may not have access to medication. You may not have access to legal advice. You may not have access to family, and you may not have access to food. However, something disturbing has happened to me this week, and that is that my former colleagues from the Consular Corps have contacted me indicating that they do not have confidence in the government and the manner in which they are handling these two specific cases. They are indicating that it is time to escalate the situation, and that time for action is now, given the genesis of these incarcerations, and that this was a clear retaliation for Ms. Wenzhou. As such, this is not just a consular matter. This is a political matter, and it requires a political response. To ignore this is a disservice to the detainees, a disservice to those Canadians traveling abroad, specifically to China, and a disservice for future relations between Canada and China. The people on the front line are recognizing the need for the Prime Minister to act, and today we are asking the government to do so. En conséquence, nous demandons au gouvernement libéral de faire deux choses. Premièrement, le Premier ministre doit appeler le président Xi pour désamorcer la situation. Il doit montrer que le chef du gouvernement au Canada est préoccupé par la situation. Il devrait prendre les mesures nécessaires afin d'obtenir la libération des Canadiens ou, à tout le moins, avoir un meilleur accès consulaire. Deuxièmement, le gouvernement doit apporter une certitude à des milliers de familles canadiennes. Les familles canadiennes ont des questions à la suite de ces arrestations et de ces détentions administratives en Chine. Même un ancien ministre des Affaires étrangères libéral a conseillé aux Canadiens de ne pas se rendre en Chine. Le gouvernement devra mettre à jour l'avis de voyage pour la Chine ou donner aux Canadiens l'assurance qu'il n'y a pas de nouveaux risques de voyager ou de travailler en Chine en raison du différend diplomatique en cours. Merci. Et maintenant, nous sommes prêts à accepter les questions.
So, yeah, we'll be starting the question period. Please stick to one question, one follow-up. Campbell Clark, Globe and Mail.
Well, Ms. Cusey, you mentioned that your former colleagues contacted you to complain about the way this is being handled. Who contacted you, and what specifically did they say?
I'm not prepared to share the individuals who have contacted me, but they have indicated that this is not consular cases as usual, that there are significant differences in that China, generally speaking, does not recognize the rule of law, and in fact, the lack of action by the Prime Minister is making their jobs as consular officials more difficult.
Specifically what they said, that the problem is that the Prime Minister hasn't phoned, or is it something else? Like, you were fairly vague, but it was a fairly general statement. What specifically did they say to you?
They said that it was the lack of a political response by political leadership in Canada.
Tonda McCharles, Toronto Star.
Yeah, just to follow up on Cam's question. So if you can't identify who's called you, can you tell us a little bit more about how many you're talking about? How many calls have you got? Have they been from consular staff in China dealing directly with the number of Canadians over there? Or if you can't say from exactly what country, can you say from what region? And have they specifically said they want the PM to call, or is that the I know that's the Conservative request, but was that their request that the Prime Minister make the call?
I can state that it was more than one. I can state that some of them are individuals who have had specific experience in China, specifically consular experience as well in China. So these are people with experience working in China as representatives of Canada. And as for your last question, they were not specific in regards to the demands. They just said that a political action is required.
And just so the government would argue that they've, garnered allied countries to express support for Canada's position. Is that the kind of thing that they're...
I believe they mean specific political action by Canada itself. As my colleague, Mr. O'Toole, indicated, our Prime Minister has gone to Trump in a roundabout fashion in an effort to try and influence this. Certainly, we are pleased to see the response of other nations in regards to the release of these detainees. But, we certainly look back to the era of the Harper administration, where we stood strongly for democracy and justice abroad, taking strong stances. And we expect this Prime Minister to do the same for Canadians now.
Mike Lecouteur, Global.
Yeah, if I might add something to that, it troubles me, and I know the Canadian families I've spoken to that have concerns about family members working in China, that the Prime Minister appears ready to call leadership in the United States, leadership in Japan, but won't pick up the phone to call Chinese leadership when the detention of the Canadians is in China. We've been calling for this for a month. The Prime Minister, comparing it to the Mr. Fahmy case, shows that he's treating this as a regular consular case when these detentions were clearly a response to an arrest in Canada. So it's a state-to-state dispute requiring leadership from the government, not just Ambassador McCallum.
Mike?
We're going to, unfortunately, when you put something like that on the table, we're going to have to press you on it. Can you please provide any more details as to who these people are, where they work? Are they currently in the public service as well, working on consular affairs?
I cannot provide any more information.
Okay, then as a follow-up, when you consider that former diplomats that almost any journalist in this room has spoken to have said, look, the way that this government is playing it right now is the right way because you can't poke the bear, so to speak. How do you respond to those people who are saying that this government is actually playing this the right way?
I'd ask you to let me know those ambassadors because, in fact, the last two major ambassadors to China, Mr. Saint-Jacques and Mr. Mulrooney, have both expressed concerns about the lack of an approach here. The government of China needs to know that the government is seized at the highest levels with this. My concern prior to Christmas was that this spread from the detention of two Canadians on so-called security grounds to the administrative, what I termed harassment, of Canadians who were having visas reviewed in China. In fact, when we brought one of the cases to Minister Freeland's office, Global Affairs and Minister Freeland's office tried repeatedly to downplay any connection to the situation in China to an extent that it led me to feel that they weren't being forthright with Canadians. The fact they haven't updated the travel advisory since October and a former deputy prime minister of the country is advising Canadians not to go shows a remarkable failure of leadership by both Minister Freeland and Prime Minister Trudeau.
Yes?
Noel Richardson, CTV. I just wanted to ask you, you quoted a former Liberal Foreign Affairs Minister who said he wouldn't go to China. You're also saying that, excuse me, the federal government needs to change the travel advisory or assure Canadians that it is in fact safe to go to China, yet you have a member of your own caucus who is presently in Shanghai. So are either of you actually concerned for Mr. Cooper's safety and the rest of the delegation that is in China right now?
We have been in contact with Mr. Cooper while he's been on the trip. As you know, the parliamentary delegation has been in contact and doing media availability as well. There's a very big distinction between a diplomatic envoy, whether a parliamentarian or a member of our foreign service traveling to China, and a Canadian, a 22-year-old person going to teach at a new private school in China who's been assured by the school that the visa was properly secured, and then 6 months or so into their tenure, they seem to be called in on administrative grounds. Those are the groups of Canadians that have questions. But I would add that when a former Foreign Affairs Minister from a previous Liberal government said that he would advise people not to go to China, to suggest that we can leave the travel advisory as is, I think doesn't satisfy the concerns that hundreds of Canadian families have. We gave two options. If they're certain that no travel advisory change is needed, the U.S. just recently changed their travel advisory, they should provide Canadians with the assurances that either Ambassador McCallum has received or that Minister Freeland has received with respect to the status of the thousands of Canadians there now.
Follow up then, would you go to China then?
I would, to try and de-escalate this situation. In fact, I'm not sure what the Prime Minister's waiting for when he's calling pretty much every other world leader except for the one he should have called last month. I would go because it's important for us to de-escalate this situation, to try and return to more pragmatic relationship with China. And I saw that as a member of the previous government, that you can have a principled foreign policy and have good relations with China on trade and a whole range of issues. I think, as Ambassador Mulroney has said, a naive or even a weak position with respect to asserting concerns over the handling of a situation is not the way to deal with China.
Charles Pinkerton, iPolitics.
Just to clarify something with you, Mrs. Cusi. So if you're not going to say anything more about the individuals, I'm just wondering if you can make clear, are these diplomats who have been in China during this experience that's now lasted about a month? Or they are? Okay.
No, pardon me, they are not.
They're not. Okay. So they have not been in China then?
Not for this particular consular case, no.
Okay. And then otherwise, I'm sure each of you have spoken with Mr. Cooper leading up to this. I'm just wondering what you've heard from him. Like, we've heard that he's raised, and the delegation itself has raised this issue. Seems like something that would be sort of difficult to just move past in a normal meeting. What else have you heard from him about how this is being dealt with there?
We've been hearing that they have been advancing concerns with relation to the two Canadians in all of their meetings. We think that's appropriate. We also like the fact that it's an all-party delegation doing that. I think here we can be a little more assertive, asking for the Prime Minister to step in. I do reiterate the point that I think Canadians should find it curious that he'll call President Trump and discuss the detention of a Chinese business leader who's on bail and in the fairest justice system in the world in Canada, but not call Chinese leadership personally to show that he's seized with the matter when there is no proper consular access in a system that does not have rule of law in China. So I understand that we've only had this second consular access recently to Mr. Corvick. Not only is his family concerned, as MP Cusi has outlined, our diplomatic corps is losing some confidence in the way this situation's been handling, but as I said, travel advisories are being looked at because if people want to change their travel plans or access travel insurance, they can do so with a travel advisory. They can't do that if they're just concerned by all the reading and all the media coverage of the detention. So we'd like the government to be much more forthright with Canadians. What type of diplomatic efforts have been made by Minister Freeland, by Ambassador McCallum, and why is the Prime Minister treating this like a consular case of a Canadian arrested in another country for circumstances out of their control, when this was a retaliatory arrest as a result of an extradition arrest in Canada? It's clear other nations are saying that. I haven't even heard Minister Freeland clearly say that she believes these are retaliatory arrests. Arbitrary arrest is a different matter entirely. If it was retaliatory, the Prime Minister needs to pick up the phone.
And if I can add, I think that Mr. Cooper has shown tremendous leadership in his trip over there in calling the situation what it is, a chilling of relations. We have yet to hear this from our leadership here in Canada, and I think he should be recognized for that.
We have about 5 more minutes and a few more questions. James Bronskill, Canadian Press.
Thank you. We spoke to Mr. Cooper today and asked what he would like to see Canadian officials do differently on this case, and he did not suggest anything. He said it's beyond me to wade into those matters, and he respected what Canadian officials are doing. How do you explain that?
Well, I'm not sure if Mr. Cooper was aware of Prime Minister Trudeau's call to President Trump. Certainly, Prime Minister Trudeau made very clear indication in his call with President Trump concerns about the extradition process and statements President Trump had made. In my view, that call was as much to show his condemnation to China of those comments than to really secure any more support from the United States than we have already had with their displeasure with these detentions. I don't think Mr. Cooper was aware of that. He's also limited, as part of a delegation, trying to push for the 2 Canadians that are being detained in a way that's appropriate while they're on the ground in the country. We have a little more liberty here to say we think that after a month of inaction, and actually you could say the administrative detention of at least a dozen more Canadians, the current approach with the Prime Minister is not working. And if he's trying to bolster support from our allies, which I think is good, why is he not willing to call the one leader that could actually de-escalate the situation?
What exactly would you have the Prime Minister say to his Chinese counterpart?
I think certainly this relates to a wider concern that we've had about state-owned enterprises from China. This shows clearly that this is not just a regular business executive. This is a state-owned enterprise, and it's seen by the state as almost a diplomatic detention would be the closest allusion. So I think what the Prime Minister has to assure President Xi is this will be handled in the most judicious and proper way, that we have probably the best justice system in the world, and that we had obligations to extradite on proper grounds that were there. I think assurances perhaps on timelines, on the fact that the Chinese citizen is on bail and living very comfortably at a time that we can't even get more than 1 month, one visit per month consular access. So we said showing he's seized with it and working towards at least more access to the 2 Canadians would be a starting point, with a goal towards eventually trying to secure their release and de-escalate the situation.
Try to pass everybody. We might stick to only one question, no follow-up for the next question, if that's all right. Campbell?
I don't understand why you want the Prime Minister to call the President and then say that's the way to de-escalate things. That's normally considered an escalation. I mean, it's usually written out as an escalation. So why do you think that top dog calling top dog is a de-escalation?
I think it's a de-escalation because the Prime Minister has made really the centerpiece of his foreign policy over 3 years the desire to enhance relationship with China en route to a free trade agreement. He needs to show that he's willing to personally invest some political capital to try and secure the release or address the so-called security concerns of the 2 Canadians.
How would I convince the Chinese that he wants to lower the tone? You're talking about de-escalation rather than saying, we want this guy back, you want him to calm things down.
The approach that currently is underway with the government is not working, Campbell. this is also not a consular case. When I saw the Prime Minister compare it to the case of Mr. Fahmy, a dual citizen who was swept up in arrest of a number of people in Egypt, that's totally different than the retaliatory detention of 2 Canadians following an arrest in Canada. If we're calling all of our other allies suggesting that this was a retaliatory arrest, are we not willing to say that publicly? I haven't heard the minister say that. So this is where the call can be soft diplomacy. They don't have to release the details of it. But showing that he has a personal stake in it at a time where there's thousands of Canadians on the ground. As I said, I took calls from family members ahead of Christmas wondering about the status of their family member there and seeing no change and no direction from their government. I think the first step to de-escalate is to show how important the Prime Minister views having these Canadians treated properly.
Tonda?
Just to go back, Ms. Kesey, you said, you clarified that the people who called you are not currently diplomats dealing with the China situation.
That's correct.
But are they currently diplomats or are they former diplomats?
Both.
So you've had more than one call? So you
Yes.
have one of each?
I would say a few of each.
Mike?
I just wanted to ask you, Ms. Kesey, in terms of that conversation, it's kind of a double-barrel question, so bear with me. When they approached you, what advice did you give them? What did you tell them? And did you advise them to voice their concerns to the current government instead of going to an opposition MP?
I didn't feel it was my position to give them advice. I thought it was my place to listen to what they had to say in an effort to work as the official opposition to resolve this case for the detainees and for the families. And I'm sorry, Mike, your second question was?
Why didn't you say to them or ask them whether or not they made these concerns known up the chain as opposed to going to an opposition member? Why did they not voice this higher in the actual government for which they work?
Sure. Certainly, having served in the Foreign Service for so many years, there is definitely a chain of command that you respect. And I think that this was the depth of their frustration in regards to this situation, the detainees, and the effects on the families, that they felt that compelled to contact me at this point.
It would be the last question.
Sorry, Mr. O'Toole, while I have you here, I just wanted to ask you a question on an unrelated matter. But over the last few weeks, Canadians might have seen CPP ads running during the NFL playoffs and the World Juniors. The CPP Investment Board spent $300,000 on these ads, which was in effect a campaign to make Canadians aware of something that they have to pay into anyway. So I'm just wondering if you think, in your view as an opposition MP, if that's a responsible use of what is in effect our own money.
Yeah, I was very surprised by the ads, and I enjoyed Mr. Coyne's column on it today. I expressed deep concern about the Prime Minister's misleading tweets, in my view, on changes to CPP that he put on Twitter to make it seem like these changes are in place now. They're changes available for a small percentage of the population in about 40 years. To see then ads around the same time that some rates will be going up for an organization that's in a monopolistic type position, as you state, did concern me. That said, CPPIB, I've had good relations with many of them from my time in the corporate world, are stellar people. But some of the concerns Mr. Coyne raised today, I think, are valid concerns. I don't think an agency like that needs to advertise because they're not securing customers. As you said, we're all customers. So the fact that it's in an election year at around the same time that there's a narrative from the government on some of their reforms, I think is concerning. And there should be a response by the head of the CPPIB.
That's all the time we had. Thank you very much.
Merci, thank you.
Merci, thank you.